Hello and welcome to the Street Crime Australia YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we're going to be looking at an infamous Australian criminal who will never be forgotten about in the criminal underworld, Ned Kelly. Edward Ned Kelly was born in December of 1854 and was an Australian bus ranger, outlaw, gang leader and a convicted police murderer. One of the last bus rangers, he is known for wearing a suit of bulletproof armour during his final shootout with the police. Mr. Kelly was born in the then British colony of Victoria as the third of 8 children to Irish parents. His father, a transported convict, died shortly after serving a 6-month prison sentence, leaving Mr. Kelly, then aged 12, as the eldest male of the household. The Kellys were a poor selector family who saw themselves as downtrodden by the Squattocracies and the victims of persecution by the Victoria police. While as a teenager, Mr. Kelly was arrested for associating with bus ranger Harry Power and served 2 prison terms for various offences, the longest stretch being from 1871 to 1874 on a conviction of receiving a stolen horse. He later joined the Greta Mob, a group of bush larkins known for stock theft. A violent confrontation with a policeman occurred at the Kelly family home in 1878, and Mr. Kelly was indicted for his attempted murder. Fleeing to the bush, Mr. Kelly vowed to avenge his mother, who was imprisoned for her role in the incident. After he, his younger brother Dan, and 2 associates, John Bryan and Steve Hart, shot dead 3 policemen, the government of Victoria proclaimed them outlaws. Mr. Kelly and his gang eluded the police for 2 years, thanks in part to the support of an extensive network of sympathisers. The gang's crime spree included raids on Eora and Gerald Deary and the killing of Aaron Sherritt, a sympathiser turned police informer. In a manifesto letter, Mr. Kelly, denouncing the police, the Victorian government and the British Empire, set down his own account of events leading up to his outlawry. Demanding justice for his family and the rural poor, he threatened dire consequences against those who divide him. In 1880, when Mr. Kelly's attempt to derail and ambush a police train failed, he and his gang, dressed in armour fashioned from stolen plough moldboards, engaged in a final gun battle with the police at Glenrowan. Mr. Kelly, the only survivor, was severely wounded by the police fire and captured, despite thousands of supporters attending rallies and signing a petition for his reprieve. Mr. Kelly was tried, convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out at the old Melbourne Gaol. His last words were famously reported to have said, "Such is life." Historian Geoffrey Searle called Mr. Kelly and his gang the last expression of the lawless frontier in what has become a highly organised and educated society. The last protest of the mighty bush, now tethered with iron rails to Melbourne and the world. In the century after his death, Mr. Kelly became a cultural icon, inspiring numerous works in the arts and popular culture, and is the subject of more biographies than any other Australian. Mr. Kelly continues to cause division in his homeland. Some celebrate him as Australia's equivalent of Robin Hood, while others regard him as a murderous villain, undeserving of his folk hero status. Journalist Martin Flanagan wrote, "What makes Ned a legend is not that everyone sees him the same, it's that everyone sees him, like a bushfire on the horizon, casting its red glow into the night." Mr. Kelly's father, John Kelly, known as Red, was born in 1820, Clonbrogan, near Moyglass, County Tipperary, Ireland. At the age of 21, he was found guilty of stealing 2 pigs and was transported to Prince Regent, arriving at Hobart Town, Van Diemen's Land, now the state of Tasmania, Australia, on the 2nd of January 1842. After finishing his sentence in January 1848, Red Kelly moved to Victoria and found work at Jane Quinn's farm at Wallan Wallan as a bush carpenter. On the 18th of November 1850, Red Kelly married Ellen Quinn, his employer's 18-year-old daughter, at St. Francis Church, with Father Gerard Ward officiating. The couple subsequently turned their attention to gold digging and earned enough to buy a small freehold in Beveridge, just north of Melbourne. At the age of 11, Mr. Kelly saved a young boy from drowning in a creek and was awarded a green sash as a recognition of his bravery. Mr. Kelly wore the sash under his armour during his last standoff at Glenrowan. It remains stained with his blood. Edward Ned Kelly was his parents' 3rd child. The exact date of his birth is not known, but it was probably in December of 1854. Ned Kelly was possibly baptised by an Augustinian priest, Charles O'Hay, who also administered the last rites to Kelly before his execution. Red and Ellen had 7 other children: Mary Jane, Annie, who was later known as Annie Gunn, Margaret, who was later known as Margaret Skillion, who was also known as Jim, Daniel, who was also known as Dan, Catherine, who was known as Kate, later Kate Foster, and Grace, who was later known as Grace Griffiths. Ned made his first court appearance at Beveridge, giving evidence, age 8, in favour of his uncle Jim Kelly, who was convicted of stealing cattle. The family did not prosper at Beveridge, and Red began drinking heavily. In 1864, the family moved to Avenel, near Seymour, where they soon attracted the attention of the local police. As a boy, Mr. Kelly obtained basic schooling and became familiar with the bush. In Avenel, he risked his life to save another boy from drowning in Hughes Creek. The boy's family gave him a green sash, which he wore under his armour during his final showdown with the police in 1880. In 1865, Red was convicted in relation to a theft of a calf and sentenced to a fine of £25 or 6 months of hard labour. Although the family could not afford to pay the fine, there is no record of him being transferred to Kilmore Gaol. In December 1866, Red was being fined for being drunk and disorderly, badly affected by alcoholism. He died at Avenel on the 27th of December 1866. The following years, the Kellys moved from Greta in northeastern Victoria near the Quinns and their relatives by marriage, the Lloyds. In 1868, Ned's uncle Jim Kelly was convicted of arson after setting fire to a rented premises where the Kellys and some of the Lloyds were staying. Jim Kelly was sentenced to death, but this was later commuted to 15 years of hard labour. The family soon took up a small farm of 88 acres at 11 Mile Creek near Greta. The farm was leased from the government under the Land Act, giving the family an option to buy once the land was successfully cleared and cultivated and other conditions were met. This type of farm was known as a selection, and those leasing it were selectors. The Kelly selection was probably unsuitable for successful farming, and Ellen supplemented her income by offering accommodation to travellers and illegally selling alcohol. In 1869, aged 14, Mr. Kelly met Irish-born Harry Power, whose alias was Henry Johnson, a transported convict who turned to bushranging in the northeastern Victoria after escaping Melbourne's Pentridge prison. The Kellys formed part of the network system of sympathisers, and by May 1869, Ned had become its bus-ranging protege. At the end of the month, they attempted to steal horses from the Mansfield property of squatter John Rowe as part of a plan to rob the Woods Point Mansfield Gold Escort. They abandoned the idea and fled back to the bush after Rowe shot at them, and Mr. Kelly temporarily broke off association with Mr. Power. Mr. Kelly's first brush with the law occurred in mid-October 1869 over an altercation between him and a Chinese pig and fowl dealer from Morse's Creek named R. Fuck. According to Mr. Fuck, as he passed the Kelly family home, Ned brandished a long stick and declared himself a bushranger before robbing him of 10 shillings. Mr. Kelly gave evidence in court that Mr. Fuck had abused his sister Annie in a dispute over Mr. Fox's request for a drink of water. Mr. Fox then beat Ned with a stick after he came to his sister's defence. Annie and the two family relatives witnessed and corroborated Ned's story, and the charge was dismissed. Mr. Kelly reconciled with Mr. Power in March of 1870, and over the next month, the pair committed a series of armed robberies as police scrambled to find them and identify Mr. Power's young accomplice. By the end of April, the press had named Mr. Kelly as the culprit, and a few days later, he was captured by the police and confined to Beechworth Gaol. Mr. Kelly fronted the court on these 3 separate robbery charges, the first 2 of which were dismissed as none of the victims could positively identify him. On the 3rd charge, the victims also reportedly failed to identify Mr. Kelly, but they were in fact refused a chance to identify him by the superintendents, Nicholas and Hare. Instead, Nicholas told the magistrate Mr. Kelly fitted the description and asked him to be remanded for trial. He was sent to Melbourne, where he spent the weekend in lockup before being transferred to Keenton to face court. No evidence was produced in court, and he was released a month after. Historians tend to disagree over this episode. Some see it as evidence of police harassment. Others believe that Mr. Kelly's family intimidated witnesses, making them reluctant to give evidence. Another factor in the lack of identification may have been that the witnesses had described Mr. Powers' accomplice as half-caste, a person of Aboriginal and European descent. However, the police believed this to be the result of Mr. Kelly going unwashed. Mr. Power often camped at Glenmore Station, a large property owned by Mr. Kelly's maternal grandfather, James Quinn, which sat at the headwaters of the King River. In June 1870, whilst resting on the mountainside gunya bark shelter that overlooked the property, Mr. Power was captured by the police search party. Following Mr. Power's arrest, word spread within the community that Mr. Kelly had informed on him. Mr. Kelly denied the rumour, and in a letter that bears only the surviving example of his handwriting, he pleads with Sergeant James Babington in Keenton for help, saying that everyone looks at me like I'm a black snake. The informant turned out to be Mr. Kelly's uncle, Jack Lloyd, who received £500 for his assistance. However, Mr. Kelly had also given information which led to Mr. Power's capture, and it is possible that the charges against him were dropped in exchange for his information. Mr. Power always believed that Mr. Kelly was responsible for the betrayal. Reporting on Mr. Power's criminal career, Benella Essine wrote, "The effect of his example has already been to draw one young fellow into the open vortex of crime, and unless his career is speedily cut short, young Mr. Kelly will blossom into a declared enemy of society." In October 1870, a hawker, Jeremiah McCormack, accused a friend of Mr. Kelly's, Ben Gold, of stealing his horse. Mr. Gold wrote an incident note to give to Mr. McCormack's childless wife that was used to wrap up 2 calves' testicles. Mr. Kelly passed it on to one of his cousins to give to the woman. When Mr. McCormack confronted Mr. Kelly later that day, Mr. Kelly punched him in the nose, causing Mr. McCormack to fall. Mr. Kelly was arrested for his part in sending the calf's parts and the note, and for assaulting Mr. McCormack. He was sentenced to 3 months hard labour in exchange for each charge. Mr. Kelly was released from Beechworth Gaol on the 27th of March 1871, 5 weeks early, and returned to Greta. 3 weeks later, horsebreaker Isaiah Wilde Wright arrived in town to see his friend Alex Gunn, a Scottish miner who had married the Kellys' older sister. Mr. Wright was riding a chestnut mare which he had borrowed without telling the owner, the postmaster, who was the postmaster of Mansfield. Mr. Kelly later claimed that he was unaware that the horse did not belong to Mr. Wright. According to Mr. Kelly, the mare went missing that night, and Mr. Gunn lent Mr. Wright one of his own horses, promising that if he found the mare, he would keep it until Mr. Wright returned. Mr. Kelly said that as soon as Mr. Wright departed, the mare was found by Mr. Gunn and a neighbour, William Brickley Williamson. Mr. Kelly then took the mare to Wangaratta, where he stayed for 4 days. On the 20th of April 1871, whilst riding back to Greta, Mr. Kelly was intercepted by Constable Edward Hall, who suspected that the horse was stolen. He directed Mr. Kelly to the police station on the pretense of having to sign some papers. As Mr. Kelly dismounted, Hall tried to grab him by the scruff of the neck but failed. When Mr. Kelly resisted arrest, Hall drew his revolver and tried to shoot him, but it misfired 3 times. He was then overpowered by Mr. Kelly, who later said that he straddled him and dug spurs into his thighs, causing the constable to roar like a big calf attacked by dogs. After subduing Mr. Kelly with the assistance of several bystanders, Hall pistol whipped him until his head became a mass roar of bleeding flesh. Mr. Kelly and Mr. Gunn were charged with horse stealing. James Murdoch, a friend and neighbour of the Kellys, gave evidence that Ned had implied to him that the horse was stolen and had tried to recruit him to steal other horses. When it was later revealed that Mr. Kelly was still in Beechworth Gaol when the horses were taken, the charges were downgraded to feloniously receiving a horse. Mr. Kelly and Mr. Gunn were sentenced to 3 years imprisonment with hard labour. Mr. Wright received 18 months for illegal use of a horse. Mr. Kelly served his sentence at Beechworth Gaol and then at HM Prison, Pentridge near Melbourne. On the 25th of June 1873, Mr. Kelly's good behaviour earned him a transfer to the prison hulk Sacramento, anchored off Williamstown. He returned to Pentridge after several months and was released on the 2nd of February 1874, 6 months early for good behaviour. When he returned to Greta, brother Jim was in prison for horse theft, and his mother soon married an American, George King. To settle the score with Mr. Wright over the chestnut mare, Mr. Kelly fought him in a bare-knuckle boxing match at the Imperial Hotel in Beechworth on the 8th of August 1874. Mr. Kelly won after 20 rounds and was declared the unofficial boxing champion of the district. Soon afterwards, a Melbourne photographer took a portrait of Mr. Kelly in a boxing pose. Mr. Wright became an ardent supporter of Mr. Kelly. After his release from prison, Mr. Kelly worked at a sawmill and later for a builder. In early 1877, he joined his stepfather in an organised horse stealing operation, along with Mr. Wright, Bricky Williamson, Joe Bryn, Aaron Sherritt, Alan Lowry, and Albert Saxon. Mr. Kelly later claimed that the group stole 280 horses altogether. A number of the group also belonged to the Greta mob, a gang of bush larkins who adopted a distinctive flash form of dress. The Greta mob also included Ned's brother, Jim and Dean, and his cousins, Tom and Jack Lloyd. On the 18th of September 1877, Mr. Kelly was arrested in Benalla for riding over a footpath whilst drunk. The following day, he was involved in a brawl with 4 police officers who were escorting him to the police court. 2 of the officers involved were constables Alex Fitzpatrick, who was a friend of Mr. Kelly, and Tom Lonergan, who had grabbed Mr. Kelly by the testicles during the farce. Mr. Kelly was found to be of being drunk and disorderly, resisting arrest, and assaulting a police officer. He was fined and released. The claim that Mr. Kelly vowed that if ever he should shoot a man, that it would be Mr. Lonergan, and probably is apocryphal. However, Mr. Kelly later claimed that Mr. Fitzpatrick subsequently harassed his family because Mr. Kelly had knocked him down during the brawl. In August 1877, Mr. Kelly, with his stepfather, George King, and a number of accomplices, had stolen 11 horses from a paddock owned by James Whitty, a wealthy local grazer. Mr. Kelly altered the brands on the horses and sold 6 of them to William Garton, a horse dealer in Barnawartha near the New South Wales border. On the 26th of September, the horses were listed as stolen and the police began an investigation. On the 10th of November, William Baumgarten and his brother Gustav were arrested for selling stolen horses, and the police were on Mr. Kelly's trail. A warrant for Mr. Kelly's arrest in relation to the Whitty larceny was sworn in March 1878, and a further warrant for the arrest of his younger brother Dan was issued on the 5th of April. Mr. Kelly's stepfather had disappeared, never to be seen again. On the 11th of April 1878, Constable Strachan, an officer in charge at the Greta police station, heard that Mr. Kelly was shearing a shed in New South Wales and was given leave to apprehend him. Constable Fitzpatrick was ordered to Greta for relief duty. Mr. Fitzpatrick read the police gazette of a warrant for Dan Kelly's arrest for horse stealing, and he discussed with his sergeant at the Benalla the idea of calling at the Kelly home on his way home to Greta to arrest Dan. The sergeant agreed, but warned him to be careful. On the 15th of April, Mr. Fitzpatrick rode through Wilton en route to Greta, stopping at the hotel there when he had 1 brandy and a lemonade. Finding Dan not at home, he remained with Mr. Kelly's mother in conversation for about an hour. 3 children were also present. According to Mr. Fitzpatrick, upon hearing someone chopping wood, he went to ensure that the chopping was licensed. The man proved to be Bricky Williamson, a neighbour who said he didn't need a license because he was chopping wood on his own selection. Mr. Fitzpatrick saw 2 horsemen making towards the house he had just left. The men proved to be the teenager Dan Kelly and his brother-in-law Bill Skilton, also known as Bill Skillings. Fitzpatrick returned to the house and made the arrest. Dan asked to be allowed to have dinner before leaving. The constable consented and stood guard over his prisoner. Minutes later, Ned Kelly rushed in through the front door and fired a shot at Mr. Fitzpatrick with a revolver, just missing him. Ellen Kelly then hit Mr. Fitzpatrick over the head with a fire shovel. There was a struggle and Mr. Kelly fired 2 more shots, wounding Mr. Fitzpatrick just above his left wrist. During the struggle, Mr. Skillion and Mr. Williamson entered the room, both armed with revolvers. Dan Kelly disarmed Mr. Fitzpatrick and now had his revolver. Ned then told Mr. Fitzpatrick that he wouldn't have fired at him if he had known it was him. Mr. Fitzpatrick fainted, and when he regained consciousness, Mr. Kelly compelled him to extract the bullet from his own arm with a knife. Mrs. Kelly dressed the wound. Ned Kelly concocted a cover story and said that if Mr. Fitzpatrick told the story, he would reward him after the Baumgarten case was over. Kelly's mother said that if he mentioned what really happened, his life would be no good to him. Mr. Fitzpatrick was then allowed to leave. He had ridden about a mile away when he noticed that 2 horsemen were pursuing him, but by spurring his horse to gallop, he escaped into the Winton Hotel, where he was assisted inside by the manager. His wound was rebandaged, and he was given a brandy and water. The hotel manager then rode with him to Benalla, where he reported the affair to his superior officer. The witnesses which can prove Mr. Fitzpatrick's falsehood can be found by advertising, and if this is not done immediately, horrible disasters shall follow. Mr. Fitzpatrick shall be the cause of greater slaughter to the rising generation than St. Patrick was to the snakes and toads in Ireland. For I have robbed, plundered, ravaged, and murdered everything I met. My character could not be painted blacker than it has been present, but thank God for my conscience as clear as it is now as the snow in Peru. Kelly, in a letter to Superintendent John Sadler and Parliamentarian Donald Cameron in December 1878. In an interview 3 months before his execution, Mr. Kelly said that at the time of the incident, he was 200 miles from home, and according to him, his mother had asked Mr. Fitzpatrick if he had a warrant, and Mr. Fitzpatrick said he'd only been given a telegram, to which his mother said that Dan did not need to go. Mr. Fitzpatrick then said, pulling out a revolver, "I will blow your brains out if you interfere." His mother replied, "You would not be so handy with that pop gun of yours if Ned was here." Dan then said, trying to trick Mr. Fitzpatrick, "There is Ned coming along the side of the house." While he was pretending to look out the window for Ned, Dan cornered Mr. Fitzpatrick, took the revolver and released Mr. Fitzpatrick unharmed. If Mr. Fitzpatrick suffered any wounds, they were possibly self-inflicted. Mr. Skillion and Mr. Williamson were not present. In 1879, Ned's sister Kate, who was 14 at the time of the incident, stated that Mr. Kelly shot Mr. Fitzpatrick after the police officer had made a sexual advance towards her. After Ned Kelly was captured, he denied that Mr. Fitzpatrick tried to take liberties with Kate. He said, "No, this is a foolish story. If he or any other policeman tried to take liberties with my sister, Victoria would not hold him." In 1929, another version of the incident had appeared, based on the interviews with the remaining Kelly brother, Jim, and Kelly cousin, and gang provider, Tom Lloyd. In this version, Mr. Fitzpatrick was drunk when he arrived at the Kellys, and while sitting in front of the fire, he pulled Kate onto his knee, provoking Dan to throw him onto the floor. In the ensuing struggle, Mr. Fitzpatrick drew his revolver. Ned appeared, and with his brother seized by the constable, disarming him, but not before he struck his wrist against the projecting part of the door lock, an injury he claimed to be a gunshot wound. 3 police officers later gave sworn evidence that Mr. Kelly, to his capture, admitted he had shot Mr. Fitzpatrick. In 1881, Bricky Williamson, who was seeking remission for his sentence in retaliation to the incident, stated that Mr. Kelly shot Mr. Fitzpatrick after the policeman had drawn his revolver. Mr. Jones and Mr. Dawson have argued that Ned Kelly shot Mr. Fitzpatrick, but it was his friend Joe Bryan who was with him, not Bill Skillion. Mr. Williamson, Mr. Skillion, and Ellen Kelly were arrested and charged with aiding and abetting an attempted murder. Ned and Dan were nowhere to be found. The 3 appeared on the 9th of October 1878 before Judge Redmond Barry. Mr. Fitzpatrick's doctor, who treated his wound, gave evidence that the policeman was certainly not drunk, and that his wounds were consistent with his statement. The defence declined to call Ned Kelly's sister Kate and 12-year-old Grace to give evidence, even though they were eyewitnesses. The defence did not call 2 witnesses to give evidence that Bill Skillion wasn't present, which would have cast doubt on Mr. Fitzpatrick's entire evidence. One of these witnesses was a friend of the Kellys. The other, Joe Ryan, was a relative. Mr. Ryan revealed that Ned Kelly was in Greta that afternoon, which was damaging to the defence. Ellen Kelly, Mr. Skillion, and Mr. Williamson were convicted as accessories to attempted murder of Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Skillion and Mr. Williamson both received sentences of 6 years, and Ellen 3 years of hard labour. Ellen Kelly's sentence was considered harsh, even by people who had no cause to be Kelly sympathisers, as she was nursing a newborn baby. Alfred Wyatt, a police magistrate from Benalla, told the later Royal Commission, "I thought the sentence upon that old woman, Mrs. Kelly, was a very severe one." After the Fitzpatrick incident, Ned Kelly, Dan Kelly, and Joe Bryan went into hiding and were soon joined by Steve Hart and a friend Dan. They were based at Bullock Creek in the Wombat Ranges, where they made money sluicing gold and distilling whiskey, and were supplied with provisions and information by sympathisers including Ned's cousin Tom Lloyd. The police had received information that the Kelly's gang were in the Wombat Ranges at the head of the King River, and on the 25th of October 1878, 2 mounted police parties were dispatched to search for them. One party, consisting of Sergeant Michael Kennedy and constables Michael Scanlan and Thomas Lonigan and Thomas McIntyre, camped overnight in an abandoned mining site in Stringy Bark Creek, about 25 miles north of Mansfield. They were unaware that they were only 1.5 miles from Mr. Kelly's gang hideout, and that Ned Kelly had observed their tracks. On the following morning, Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Scanlan went scouting whilst Mr. McIntyre and Mr. Lonigan remained at the camp. At about 5 PM, 4 members of Mr. Kelly's gang emerged from the bush and ordered the 2 policemen in the camp to bail up and raise their arms. According to Mr. McIntyre, each member of the gang was armed with a rifle, but according to Ned Kelly, they only had 2 guns. The Kelly gang prepares to open fire as Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Scanlan arrive. Mr. Lonigan's body lies in the foreground. Mr. McIntyre was unarmed at the time and raised his arms. According to Mr. McIntyre, Mr. Lonigan made a motion to draw his revolver and ran for cover of the tree a few yards away. Ned Kelly immediately shot Mr. Lonigan and killed him. According to Ned, Mr. Lonigan had ducked behind a fallen tree and Ned shot him as he raised his head out to fire. The Kelly gang now questioned Mr. McIntyre and armed themselves with the policeman's shotgun and revolvers. At about 5:30 PM, Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Scanlan returned on horseback and the Kelly gang hid themselves. According to Mr. McIntyre, he walked up towards Mr. Kennedy, but before he could speak to him, the Kelly gang ordered the police to bail up. Mr. Kennedy tried to unclip his gun holster and shots were fired by the gang. Mr. McIntyre invited Mr. Kennedy to surrender as he was surrounded. Meanwhile, Mr. Scanlan dismounted and was shot whilst trying to unsling his rifle. Mr. McIntyre stated that Mr. Scanlan didn't have time to fire a shot. According to Ned, Mr. Scanlan fired and Ned shot him as he tried to fire again. Mr. Scanlan died soon after the wounding. Kennedy had dismounted and, according to Mr. McIntyre, tried to surrender without firing a shot, but the gang continued firing at him. According to Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy hid behind a tree and started firing. In the exchange of gunfire, Mr. McIntyre, who was still unarmed, mounted Mr. Kennedy's horse and was able to escape. Mr. Kennedy retreated into the bush. Ned and Dan pursued him for almost a mile, exchanging gunfire with the policeman, before Ned shot him in the right side. According to Ned, Mr. Kennedy then turned around to face him and Ned shot him in the chest with his shotgun, not realising that Mr. Kennedy had dropped his revolver and was turning round to surrender. Mr. McIntyre reached Mansfield Police Station the following day and a search party quickly found the bodies of Mr. Lonigan and Mr. Scanlan. Mr. Kennedy's body was found 2 days later. The bodies had been looted of watches, rings and other personal items. The post-mortem examination showed that Mr. Lonigan had been shot 3 times through the arm, the leg and the right eye, the latter being the cause of death. Mr. Scanlan had 4 bullet wounds. Mr. Kennedy had at least 2 bullet wounds, 1 shotgun wound through the chest fired from a very close range. Mr. McIntyre's initial accounts of the Stringy Bark police killings were given at Mansfield on the 27th of October and at the inquest into the deaths of Mr. Lonigan and Mr. Scanlan on the 29th of October. Ned Kelly's initial accounts of the killings were given in his Cameron letter of December 1878 and Geraldine letter of February 1879. These and later accounts by Mr. McIntyre and Mr. Kelly varied in their details. Mr. Jones and Mr. Morrissey and others have questioned the credibility of some aspects of Mr. McIntyre's and Mr. Kelly's version of events. In the Geraldine letter, Mr. Kelly claimed that he had been told that a number of police officers had boasted that they would shoot him without giving him a chance to surrender. He also claimed that the weapons, especially the 2 rifles, and the amount of ammunition that the police party had carried indicated their intention of killing him rather than arresting him. He claimed that these circumstances and the failure of the police to surrender when ordered to justified him killing them in self-defense. Mr. McIntyre stated that he told Mr. Kelly that the intention of the police party was to arrest him and that they were not excessively armed in the circumstances. He stated that it was the Kelly gang who confronted the police with their weapons drawn and that they did not give the police a realistic chance to surrender. Proclamation by the Governor George Bowen declared Ned and Dan Kelly outlaws. News of the police murders led to widespread fear of the bushrangers. On the 28th of October, the government announced a reward of $8,000, $200 per head for their arrest, and this was soon increased to $2,000. On the 31st of October 1878, the Victorian Parliament passed the Felons Apprehension Act, and it came into effect on the 1st of November. 3 days later, notices were published throughout the colony, giving the bushrangers until the 12th of November to surrender themselves. On the 15th of November, the 4 members of the Kelly gang, not having surrendered themselves, were declared outlaws. The outlaws could be killed without challenge by anyone finding them armed, or who had a reasonable suspicion that they were armed. Act also penalised anyone who gave any aid, shelter or sustenance to outlaws, or withheld information or gave false information about them to the authorities. The punishment was imprisonment with or without hard labour for such periods not exceeding 15 years. The Felons Apprehension Act eventually lapsed on the 26th of June 1880, just before the siege at Glenrowan. The Victorian Act was based on the New South Wales Felons Apprehension Act of 1865, which had been enacted in response to the bushrangers Dan Morgan and Ben Hall. In response to the Kelly gang, the New South Wales Parliament reenacted their legislation of the Felons Apprehension Act in 1879. After the Stringy Bark Creek police killings, the Kelly gang unsuccessfully attempted to escape across the flooded Murray River into New South Wales before returning to their base in northeastern Victoria. They had narrowly avoided the police on several occasions and were relying on the support of the extended Kelly family, criminal associates, and other sympathisers. In need of money, the gang planned to rob the bank in the small town of Euroa. On Sunday the 8th of December 1878, Joe Bryan scouted the town and reported back that there would be a funeral and a sitting at the licensing court on the following Tuesday afternoon that many in the town would be attending. At 12:30 PM on the 9th of December, the Kelly gang held up the Young Husband Storial substation at Faithful's Creek, 3 miles from Aurora. 14 male employees and passerbys were taken hostage and held overnight in a brick outbuilding near the Faithful Creek's homestead. Female hostages were held in the homestead. One of the hostages was a passing hawker who supplied 4 members of the Kelly gang with new respectable clothes. It is probable that the hawker and a number of other hostages were sympathisers of the gang and had prior knowledge of the raid. The following day, Dan guarded the hostages while Ned, Mr. Bryan and Mr. Hart rode out to wreck the telegraph wires connecting Aurora to the outside world. After cutting the wires, the gang encountered a hunting party and some railway workers whom they held up and took back to Faithful's Creek as hostages. Ned, Dan and Mr. Hart then went to Euroa, leaving Mr. Bride to guard the prisoners. Just after 4 PM, 3 gang members knocked at the doors of the closed National Bank in Euroa and gained entry from the front and back. They drew their revolvers and held up the bank and the bank's manager's living quarters in the building. They emptied the safes and cashier drawers, and cash and gold worth $2,260, and a number of documents and securities were stolen. The 14 members of the bank manager's household and staff were taken back to Faithful's Creek homestead as hostages. Back at Faithful's Creek, the gang performed some trick riding for the hostages, who now numbered 37, before leaving at about 8:30 PM, warning their captives to remain where they were for 3 hours, or there would be reprisals. Following the raid, a number of newspapers commented on the efficiency and the execution and compared it with the inefficiency of the police, who had failed to capture the gang in the 6 weeks since the Stringy Bank police killings. Several hostages stated that the gang had behaved courteously and without violence during the raid. However, hostages also stated that on several occasions, Ned Kelly and other gang members had become enraged and they cocked their revolvers and pointed them at the hostages, threatening to shoot them. The gang had also threatened to burn buildings containing hostages if there was any resistance. While at Faithful's Creek homestead, Joe Bryan wrote out 2 fair copies of a letter that he had been dictated by Mr. Kelly. On the 14th of December 1878, the copies were posted to Donald Cameron, a Victorian paramilitarian who Mr. Kelly wrongly thought was sympathetic to the gang. and John Sadler, a police superintendent at Benalla. In the letter, Mr. Kelly made claims of police corruption and harassment of his family and gave his version of the Fitzpatrick incident, the Stringy Bark police killings and other events. Mr. Kelly expected Mr. Cameron to read the letter out in Parliament, but the government refused to make it public. Newspapers, however, published summaries of the contents with commentary. Mr. Kelly later repeated much of the contents of the letter in a longer Gerardieri letter. The imprisonment of 23 Kelly sympathisers without trial swung public sympathy away from the police. On the 2nd of January 1879, the police used the Felons Apprehension Act to obtain warrants for the arrest of the presumed Kelly sympathisers for aiding the outlaws. 30 men were arrested in the following days and the 23 remained in custody. Among the leading Kelly sympathisers who were held were Tom Lloyd Jr., Jimmy Quinn, Wild Wright and Joe Ryan. Over a third were released within 7 weeks due to a lack of evidence, but a core of 9 sympathisers had their remand renewed on a weekly basis for almost 3 months, despite the failure of the police to produce any evidence for a committal hearing. The police claimed that their informants were reluctant to give sworn evidence for fear of reprisals. On the 22nd of April, police magistrate Mr. Foster refused prosecution requests to continue remands and discharged the remaining 11 detainees. Although the police command was disturbed by this decision, by then it was clear that the tactic of the holding sympathisers on continuous remand had not impeded the activities of the Kelly gang. Mr. John argues that the decision to hold the key Kelly sympathisers without trial for several months swung public sympathy away from the police. Mr. Dawson, however, points out that whilst there was widespread commendation of the denial of the civil liberties of those detained, this did not necessarily mean that there was a widespread support for the outlaws. Following the Euroa raid, 58 police were transferred to northeastern Victoria, making a total of 217 police in the district. Around 50 soldiers were deployed to guard the banks in the region, and the reward for Ned Kelly's capture was close to $1,000. The Kelly gang had distributed most of the proceeds from the raid to the family, friends and associates who had given them assistance when they needed it. The outlaws were once more in need of funds and planned to rob the bank at Gerardieri, a town of 500 residents, about 40 miles across the border of New South Wales. A number of sympathisers moved into the town in the days before the raid to provide information and undercover support for the gang. On Friday, the 7th of February 1879, the Kelly gang crossed the Murray River between Moala and Cumwell and camped overnight in a thick forest. The following day, they visited Davidson Inn, about 2 miles from Gerardieri, where they drank and chatted with patrons about staff, learning more about the town and the police presence there. Just after midnight on Sunday morning, the 9th of February, the gang went to Gerardieri Police Barracks, about half a mile from the town centre, on the pretext of alerting the police to a fictitious brawl at Davidson's Inn. After confirming that there were only 2 policemen present, Senior Constable George Devine and Probationary Constable Henry Richard, gang drew their revolvers and bailed up the policemen. They secured the policemen in a lockup near the main building and spent the night in the residential quarters of the police station, where they held Mr. Devine's wife and young children hostage. The gang spent most of Sunday morning preparing for the bank robbery, while many of the town's population were attending church. On Sunday afternoon, Mr. Bryan and Mr. Hart, dressed in police uniforms, took the disarmed Constable Richards with them into town so they could familiarise themselves with its layout. Mr. Richards was told to introduce the strangers as police reinforcements sent to search for Mr. Kelly's gang. The 3 then returned to the police barracks, and the gang finalised the plan for the following day's raid. At 10 AM on the 10th of February, Ned Kelly and Mr. Bryn donned police uniforms, and the 4 outlaws took Mr. Richards with them into town. They had left Mrs. Devine in the police lockup and had warned Mrs. Devine that if she tried to leave the barracks, they would burn it down with her and her children inside. The gang went into the main street of Gerardieri and held up the Royal Mail Hotel, which was next door to the new Bank of New South Wales. They took the hotel staff and patrons prisoner. As the raid progressed, anyone walking into the hotel was taken prisoner and held in the parlour of the hotel. It is almost certain that some of those held were sympathisers planted by the outlaws. Ned Kelly and Mr. Bryn then entered the bank from the rear, leaving Dan Kelly and Mr. Hart in control of the hotel. Ned Kelly and Mr. Bryn held up the bank, taking $2,141 in cash and jewellery and other valuables. Mr. Kelly also took deeds, mortgages and securities from the safe, which he later had burned because the bloody banks are crushing the lives and blood out of the poor, struggling man. Bank staff and several people who entered the bank were taken prisoner and transferred to the parlour of the hotel. Mr. Bryn then held up the post office and destroyed the Morse key and the insulator. Following this, several of the prisoners were ordered to take axes and bring down the telegraph poles and the wires. Once the telegraph was cut out, Ned Kelly went with 2 hostages to the newspaper owner's home, where he asked for copies of his Gerald Deary letter to be printed. The newspaper owner, however, had earlier escaped capture at the bank and had fled the town. After a detour to appraise a locally famous racehorse, Mr. Kelly returned to the Royal Mail Hotel, where he delivered a speech to the hostages, outlining his grievances against the police and the justice system. Mr. Kelly then told the hostages, who is now numbered about 30, that they were free to go. However, he took Mr. Richards and the 2 post office workers who knew how to operate the telegraph with him to the police barracks. Back at the barracks, the gang secured the 2 policemen and the 2 post office employees in the lockup and prepared to leave with the proceeds of the bank robbery, police horses and police weapons. Mrs. Devine was threatened with reprisals if she released the prisoners before 7:30 p.m. Dan Kelly and Mr. Bryn then rode out of Gerald Deary. Ned Kelly and Mr. Hart rode back into town, where Ned stayed a short while, drinking at the Albion, the Traveller's Rest Hotel, with strangers who had recently entered the town and was soon to leave. Whilst there, a local parson, John Gribble, persuaded Mr. Kelly to leave the racehorse he had taken, as it belonged to a young lady. Mr. Kelly and Mr. Hart left, and they were not seen again by police for 17 months. Prior to arriving in Gerald Deary, Mr. Kelly composed a lengthy letter with the aim of tracing his path to the outlawry, justifying his actions and outlining the alleged injustices he and his family suffered at the hands of the police. He also decries the treatment of the poor selector families by Victoria's Squattocracy, and in an escalating promise of revenge and retribution, invokes a mythical tradition of Irish rebellion against what he calls the tyrannism of English yoke. Dictated to Mr. Bryn, it is known as the Gerald Deary letter and is a handwritten document of 56 pages, 7,391 words. While holding up at Gerald Deary, Mr. Kelly gave the letter, which he called A Bit of My Life, to Edwin Living, a local bank accountant, and demanded that he deliver it to the editor of Gerald Deary and the Urara Gazette for publication. Due to his political suppression, only excerpts were published in the press, based on a copy transcribed by John Hanlon, owner of the 8 Mile Hotel in Dennequil. The entire letter was rediscovered and published in 1930. According to historian Alex McDermott, Mr. Kelly inserts himself into history on his own terms, with his own voice. We hear the living speaker in a way that no other document in our history achieves. It has been interpreted as a pro-Republican manifesto. For others, it's a murderous, maniacal rant and a remarkable insight into Mr. Kelly's grandiosity. Noted for its unorthodox grammar, the letter reaches delirious poetics, Kelly's language being hyperbolic, elusive, hallucinatory, full of striking metaphors and images. His invective and sense of humour are also present. In one well-known passage, he calls the Victorian police a parcel of big ugly fat-necked wombat-headed, big-belly, magpie-legged, narrow-hipped, blore-footed son of Irish bailiffs and English landlords. The letter closes, neglect this and abide by the consequences, which shall be worse than the rust of the wheat of Victoria on the drought of the dry season to the grasshoppers in the New South Wales. I do not wish to give the order of full force without giving timely warning, but I am a widow's son outlawed, and my orders must be obeyed. An £8,000 reward was put up for the Kelly gang, which is the equivalent of 1.5 million modern Australian dollars. In response to the Jeradiri raid, the New South Wales government and several banks collectively issued £4,000 for the gang's capture, dead or alive, the largest reward offered in the colony since £5,000 was placed on the heads of the outlawed Clark brothers in 1867. The Victorian government matched the offer for the Kelly gang, bringing the total amount to £8,000, bus ranging's largest ever reward. The Victorian police continued to receive many reports of sightings of outlaws from the public and information about the activities from their network of paid informants. The Chief Commissioner of Police, Frederick Standish, and Superintendent Francis Hare directed operations against the gang from Benalla. Mr. Hare organised frequent search parties and surveillance of the close family members and associates of the outlaws. A native police unit sent from Queensland to Victoria in 1879 was also there to help capture the gang. In March 1879, 6 Queensland native police troopers and a senior constable under the command of Sub-Inspector Stanhope O'Connor were deployed to Benalla to join a hunt for the Kelly gang. Mr. O'Connor and his troopers, at the time of request, were in active service at Cookstown region, conducting punitive expeditions against indigenous communities, and had recently massacred 30 people near Cape Bedford. Although Ned Kelly feared the tracking ability of the Aboriginal troopers, Standish and Hare doubted their value, and they were not put to their best use. The Aboriginal troopers were withdrawn on the 25th of June 1880, but quickly re-engaged following the murder of the police informant Aaron Sherritt the following day. On the 7th of May 1879, Mr. Standish provided the Victorian Land Board with a list of 84 family members and other alleged sympathisers of the outlaws in order to prevent them from buying land in the secluded areas of the northeastern Victoria. The avowed aim of the policy was to disperse the Kelly family and its sympathisers and disrupt stock theft in the region. The impact of the policy is controversial. Mr. Jones and others claim that it caused widespread resentment and hardened support for the outlaws. Mr. Morrissey, however, states that although the policy was sometimes used unfairly, it was effective and supported by the majority of the community. By the 3rd of July 1879, following media and parliamentary criticism at the cost and lack of success of the Kelly gang search, Mr. Standish appointed Assistant Commissioner Charles Nicholson in charge of the operations at Benalla in place of the injured Hare. Mr. Standish removed 14 troopers and 17 foot police from Mr. Nicholson's command, withdrew most of the soldiers guarding the banks, and cut the budget for the search. Mr. Nicholson responded by cutting back search parties and relying more heavily on targeted surveillance and his network of spies and informers. On the 2nd of July 1880, after almost a year of unsuccessful efforts to capture the outlaws, Mr. Nicholson was replaced by Mr. Hare. On the 20th of May, a police informant, Daniel Kennedy, had reported that the Kelly gang had successfully made bulletproof armour out of agricultural equipment and were planning another raid. On the 20th of June, Mr. Kennedy personally reported the information about the armour and the impending raid to Mr. Hare. Mr. Hare dismissed the intelligence as preposterous and sacked Mr. Kennedy. During the Mr. Kelly outbreak, police watch parties monitored houses belonging to the relatives of the gang, including that of Mr. Brin's mother in the Woodshed Valley near Beechworth. Police used the house of a neighbour, former Greta Mob member and lifelong friend of Mr. Brin, Aaron Sherritt, as the base of operations, sleeping in it during the day and keeping watch from nearby caves in the night. Mr. Sherritt accepted police payments for camping the watch parties and providing information on the bus rangers' activity. It is likely that Mr. Sherritt also gave the police false information in order to protect Mr. Brin. Detective Michael Ward was particularly sceptical of Mr. Sherritt's value as an informant. In March 1879, Mr. Brin's mother discovered Mr. Sherritt with a police surveillance party and later publicly denounced him as a police spy. In the following months, Mr. Brin and Ned Kelly sent Mr. Sherritt messages stating that Mr. Lloyd's and Mr. Quinn's wanted him shot and that it would be better for him if he came and joined the outlaws. When Mr. Sherritt continued his relationship with the police, Mr. Brin warned Mr. Sherritt's mother that the outlaws were going to kill Mr. Sherritt. The gang finally decided to murder Mr. Sherritt as part of their own plan, one that they boasted would not only astonish not only the Australian colonies but the entire world. On the 26th of June 1880, Dan and Mr. Bryn rode into the Woodshed Valley. That evening, they kidnapped Anton Wick, who lived near Mr. Sherritt, and forced him to come with them to Mr. Sherritt's hut, which was occupied by Mr. Sherritt, his pregnant wife Ellen, Mrs. Berry, Ellen's mother, and 4 policemen who had been stationed in the hut to guard Mr. Sherritt and spy on Mrs. Bryn's home. At around 6:30 PM, Dan went to the front door of the hut, while Mr. Bryn forced Mr. Wick to knock on the back door and call out for Mr. Sherritt. When Mr. Sherritt answered the door, Mr. Bryn shot him in the throat and chest with a shotgun, killing him. Mr. Bryn then entered the hut and Dan was let in while 4 policemen hid in the bedroom. Mr. Bryn heard the police scrambling for their shotguns and demanded that they come out. When the police didn't respond, he fired into the bedroom. He then sent Ellen into the bedroom to bring the police out, but they held onto her in the room. The outlaws were left in the hut with Mrs. Barry, collected kindling, and loudly threatened to burn those alive still inside. They sent Mrs. Barry back inside and the police detained her in the bedroom. After failed attempts to set fire to the building, the outlaws stayed outside yelling threats to the occupants. They then released Mr. Wick and rode away, ending a 2-hour siege. The police, however, didn't leave the hut until the following morning, for fear that the bush rangers would still be waiting outside for them. News of Mr. Sherritt's death only reached Hare in Benalla at 2:30 PM on Sunday on the 27th of June. The gang estimated that the policemen inside Mr. Sherritt's hut would relay the news of his murder to Beechworth by the early Sunday morning, prompting a special police train to be sent up from Melbourne. They also summarised that the train would collect reinforcements in Benalla through Glenrowan, a small town in the Warby Ranges. There, the gang planned to wreck the train and shoot dead any survivors, then ride to an unpoliced Benalla where they would rob the banks, set fire to the courthouse, blow up the police barracks, release anybody imprisoned in the gaol, and generally play havoc with the entire town before returning to the bush. Bryn and Dan were still in the Woodshed Valley. Ned and Mr. Hart tried but failed to damage the track at Glenrowan, so they forced 2 local plate layers and some labourers camped nearby to finish the job. The outlaws selected a sharp curve in the line that ran across the ravine and told their captors that they were going to send the train and its occupants to hell. Mr. Bryn and Dan Kelly had now arrived at Glenrowan and the gang had taken over the railway station, the station master's home, and Ann Jones's Glenrowan Inn opposite the railway station and in just under a mile away from the town centre. The gang used the hotel to hold the workers, passers-by and other male prisoners. They gathered throughout the night and the following day. Most of the women and children taken prisoner were held at the station master's home. The other hotel in town, Mr. McDonald's Railway Hotel, on the other side of the tracks, was used to stable the gang's stolen horses, one of which carried a tin of blasting powder and fuses. Their pack horses also carried suits of bullet-repelling armour, each complete with a helmet and weighing about 44 kilograms. The armour was designed to provide protection for the outlaws as they stood up to the top embankment, firing down to any survivors of the train wreck. There was no leg armour as it would hinder the outlaws' movement, and it wasn't necessary given the angle of return fire up at the embankment. There is a sketch by George Gordon Cray which shows the gang dancing with the hostages. By Sunday afternoon, the expected train had not arrived and the outlaws had moved most of the women and children to Glenrowan Inn. There were now 62 hostages, including sympathisers who the gang had planted to help control the situation. As the hours passed without any sight of train, the gang plied the hostages with drink and organised music, singing, dancing and games. One hostage later testified, Ned did not treat us badly, not at all. However, Ned Kelly threatened to shoot another young hostage, keeping him in a state of extreme terror for about half an hour. During the late afternoon and the evening of Sunday, Ned allowed 21 hostages who he considered trustworthy to leave. At about 10 PM, Ned and Mr. Bryn captured Glenrowan's lone constable, Hugh Bracken, with the assistance of hostage Thomas Curnow, a local schoolmaster who sought to gain the gang's trust in order to thwart their plans. Believing that Mr. Curnow was a sympathiser, Ned let him and his wife return to their home close to the railway tracks, but warned them to go quietly to bed and not to dream too loud. The police train Ned Kelly had been expecting only left Benalla at 2 AM on Monday. The train carried 7 regular troopers under Superintendent Hare, 5 Queensland Aboriginal troopers under Sub-Inspector O'Connor, 4 journalists and several other civilians. Acting on intelligence that the track had been sabotaged, Mr. Hare had ordered a pilot engine to travel ahead of the police train. At 2:30 AM, a pilot train was approaching Glen Road when Mr. Kunnau went to its tracks, signalled it to stop, and alerted the driver of danger. Ned Kelly had decided to let the hostages return home and was delivering them a lecture about police informers when Mr. Byrne came from outside with news that the train had arrived. The outlaws donned their armour and prepared themselves for the confrontation. Mr. Bracken, meanwhile, told the hostages to lie low and escaped to the railway station to explain the situation to the police. On hearing Mr. Bracken's news, Hare immediately led a dispatchment of police towards the hotel while the main body of troopers prepared for the horses and equipment. It was just after 3 AM. The 4 outlaws positioned themselves in the shadows in the veranda in the front of the building and opened fire when the police were about 30 yards away in the moonlight. The police returned fire and about 100 to 150 shots were fired in 15 minutes. Someone shouted that there were women and children inside the building and there was a lull in the shooting. Mr. Hare was wounded in the left wrist and soon had to return to Benalla for treatment. Ned Kelly was wounded in the left hand and arm and his right foot. Joe Byrne was shot in his leg and retreated to the hotel. 2 hostages were fatally wounded by the police fire through the thin weatherboard walls of the building. 13-year-old John Jones and railway worker Martin Cherry. A 3rd hostage, George Metcalf, was also fatally wounded, either by the police fire or shot accidentally by Ned Kelly in an earlier incident. The gang and police exchanged gunfire. During the lull of firing, a number of hostages, mostly women and children, escaped from the hotel. Ned Kelly, bleeding heavily from his wounds, retreated behind the hotel and made his way into the bush, where police found his school cap and rifle around 3:30 AM, around 100 yards from the hotel. Mr. Kelly later stated that, at the time, he was in the bushes not far from the police. The police surrounded the hotel throughout the night and the firing continued intermittently. At around 5 AM, Mr. Byrne was fatally shot in the groin while making a toast to the Kelly gang in a bar. Between 5:30 AM and 7 AM, police reinforcements under Sergeant Steele and Superintendent Sadler arrived from Wangaratta and Benalla, taking the police contingent to about 40. A strange apparition when Mr. Kelly appeared out of the mist, shrouded bush, clad in armour. Bewildered policemen took him to be a ghost, a bunyip, and Old Nick himself. Historians disagree over Mr. Kelly's movement after he had left the hotel. Mr. Jones speculates that he had ridden away to meet sympathisers and had returned to the hotel in time to see Mr. Byrne get shot, then crossed police lines again into the bush. Mr. Dawson, however, argues that Mr. Kelly's wounds were serious and he had lain in the bush for most of the time and had not returned to the hotel. At dawn, about 7 AM, Ned Kelly, dressed in his armour and armed with 3 handguns, came out of the bush and attacked the police from their rear. The police returned fire and wounded Mr. Kelly, staggering towards the hotel, his heavy armour repelling the bullets. Eyewitnesses variously compared Mr. Kelly's appearance to a bunyip, a devil and a ghost. Journalist Tom Carrington wrote, "With the stem rising from the ground, it looked for all the world like a ghost of Hamlet's father, with no head, only wearing a thick long neck. It was the most extraordinary sight I've ever saw or read in my life. I felt fairly spellbound with the wonder. I could not stir or speak." Sergeant Steele and the railway guard, Mr. Dosset, captured Mr. Kelly. The gun battle lasted for half an hour, Dan Kelly and Mr. Hart providing intermittent covering fire from the hotel, until Mr. Steele brought down Ned Kelly with 2 shotgun blasts to his unprotected legs and thighs. Mr. Kelly was disarmed and carried to the railway station where a doctor attended to his wounds. In the meantime, the siege continued. At around 10 AM, a ceasefire was called and the remaining 30 hostages left the hotel. The police ordered the hostages to lie down and they were checked to ensure that the outlaws were not among them. 2 of the hostages were arrested for being known Kelly sympathisers. By Monday afternoon, a crowd of some 600 spectators had gathered around Glen Rowan, and Dan Kelly and Mr. Hart had ceased shooting. Unwilling to allow his men to storm the hotel, Mr. Sadler ordered a cannon to be sent to blast out the outlaws, but then decided them to be burnt out. At 2:50 PM, Senior Constable Giles Johnson, supported by covering fire from the police, set fire to the Glen Rowan Inn. Matthew Gibney, a Catholic priest, entered the burning building in an attempt to rescue anyone inside, and discovered the bodies of Mr. Bryn, Dan Kelly and Mr. Hart. The exact circumstances of the death of Dan Kelly and Mr. Hart remains a mystery. The police recovered the body of Mr. Byrne from the hotel bar and rescued the seriously wounded hostage, Martin Cherry, from the kitchen behind the hotel, but he unfortunately died soon after. After the fire died out at 4 PM, the police recovered the badly burnt bodies of Dan Kelly and Mr. Hart. The death toll at Glen Rowan included 3 members of the Kelly gang and the hostages Martin Cherry, John Jack Jones, who died the following day at Wangaratta Hospital, and George Metcalf, who died from a gunshot wound several months later. John's sister, Jane Jones, received a head wound during the siege from a stray bullet, and 2 years later died from a lung infection that her mum believed was hastened by the injury. Others wounded were hostages Michael Reardon and his baby sister Bridget, who was grazed by a bullet, Superintendent Hare, and an Aboriginal trooper. Kelly suffered more than 24 gunshot wounds. The following day, police tied Mr. Byrne's body to the door of the Benalla lockup to be photographed. His friends asked for the body, but the police instead arranged a hasty inquiry and burial in a pauper's grave in Benalla Cemetery. The charred remains of Dan and Mr. Hart were taken to Greta and buried by their families in unmarked graves in the local cemetery. Mr. Kelly survived to stand trial on the 19th of October 1880 in Melbourne before Sir Redmond Barry, the judge who had earlier sentenced Mr. Kelly's mother to 3 years in prison for attempted murder of Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Smith and Mr. Chomley appeared for the Crown, and Mr. Bindon for the prisoner. The trial was adjourned to the 28th of October, when Mr. Kelly was presented on the charge murdering Constable Lonigan and Constable Scanlan. He was never charged with the murder of Sergeant Kennedy. He was charged with various bank robberies and the murder of Mr. Sherritt, resisting arrest at Glen Rowan, and with a long list of minor charges. He was convicted of the willful murder of Mr. Lonigan and sentenced to death by hanging. After handing down the sentence, Sir Redmond Barry concluded with the customary words, "May God have mercy on your soul," to which Mr. Kelly replied, "I will go a little further than that and say, I will see you there, where I go." On the 3rd of November, the Executive Council of Victoria decided that Mr. Kelly was to be hanged 8 days later, on the 11th of November, at the Old Melbourne Gaol. In the week leading up to the execution, thousands turned out to street rallies across Melbourne, demanding the reprieve for Mr. Kelly, and on the 8th of November, a petition for clemency, with over 32,000 signatures, some of which were suspicious of nature, was presented to the Governor's private secretary. The Executive Council announced soon after that the hanging would proceed as scheduled. The day before his execution, Mr. Kelly had his photographic portrait taken as keepsake for his family, and he was granted farewell interviews with relatives. His mother's last words to him were reported to be, "Mind you die like a Kelly." The following morning, John Castillo, the Governor of Gaul, informed Mr. Kelly that the hour of execution had been fixed at 10 AM. Mr. Kelly's long irons were removed, and after a short time he was marched out. He was stonic on the way, and when passing the Gaul's flower beds, he remarked, "What a nice little garden," but said nothing further until he reached the press room, where he remained until the arrival of the chaplain, Dean Donaghy. Accounts differ about Mr. Kelly's last words. Some newspaper reporters wrote that it was "such is life," whilst other newspapers recorded that this was his response when he was told the intended hour of his execution earlier that day. The Angus wrote that Mr. Kelly's last words were, "Oh well, I suppose it has come to this," as the rope was placed around his neck. According to another account, Mr. Kelly intended to make a speech, but made no audible sound. The warden later wrote that Mr. Kelly, when prompted to say his last words, mumbled something, but he couldn't understand what he said. Ned Kelly's armour is on display in the State Library of Victoria. The helmet, breastplate, backplate and shoulder plates show 18 bullet marks. Also on display are Mr. Kelly's Snyder Enfield rifle and one of his boots. The Royal Commission into Police Conduct during Kelly's outbreak resulted in many force members being reprimanded, demoted, suspended or dismissed. In March 1881, the Victorian government approved the Royal Commission into the conduct of the Victoria Police during the Kelly outbreak. Over the next 6 months, the commission, chaired by Francis Longmore, held 66 meetings, examined 62 witnesses, and visited towns throughout the Kelly country. While its report found that the police had acted properly in relation to the criminality of the Kellys, it exposed widespread corruption and shattered a number of police careers. In addition to that, the Chief Commissioner, Frederick Standish, numerous other officers, including senior staff, were reprimanded, demoted or suspended. It concluded with a list of 36 recommendations for reform. Mr. Kelly hoped that his death would lead to an investigation into police conduct, and although the report did not exonerate him or his gang, its findings were said to strip the authorities of what scanty rags of reputation the Kellys had left. The £8,000 reward money was divided among various claimants, with £6,000 going to the members of the Victoria Police, Superintendent Hare receiving the lion's share of £800. The Colonel complained about his payout of £550, and the following year it was upgraded to £1,000. 7 Aboriginal trackers involved in the siege were each rewarded £50, but their money was given to the Victoria and Queensland governments for safekeeping. The reward board's argument being it would not be desirable to place any considerable sum of money into the hands of a person unable to use it. There was media and police speculation that there would be further outbreaks of violence in the northeastern Victoria following Mr. Kelly's execution. Mr. Jones and Mr. Dawson argue that changes in policing methods reduce this threat. The police held informal discussions with the Kelly family to ensure them that they would be treated fairly if they kept the peace. The police no longer pursued a policy of dispersing the Kelly family and sympathisers by denying them the land in the northeastern Victoria, but rather explicitly tied access to land to lawful behaviour. During Longmore Royal Commissions, there were threats of violence and intimidation against people who had assisted the police. Nevertheless, the police reported a reduction in horse and cattle theft and crime in general in the region following the end of the Kelly outbreak. Mr. Kelly's mother was released from prison in February 1881. Mrs. Jones states that she met the Greta Police Constable, Robert Graham, soon after, and they reached an understanding which helped reduce tension in the community. Mrs. Kelly died aged 95 on the 27th of March 1923. Kelly's death mask is on display in the National Portrait Gallery. In line with the practice of the day, no records were kept regarding the disposal of an executed person's remains. Mr. Kelly was buried in the Old Man's Yard just outside the walls of Old Melbourne Gaol. A newspaper reported that Mr. Kelly's body was dissected by medical students who removed his head and organs for study. Dissection outside of a canonical inquiry was illegal. Public outrage at the rumour raised real fears of public disorder, leading to the Commissioner of the Police to write to Gaul's governor, who denied that the dissection had taken place. Saw cuts on a piece of his occipital bone, recovered in 2011, confirmed that a dissection had been done. In 1929, Melbourne Gaol was closed for a routine demolition, and the bodies in the graveyard were uncovered during the demolition works. During the recovery of bodies, spectators and workers stole skeletal parts and skull from a number of graves, including one marked with an arrow and one with the initials EK, in belief that they belonged to Ned Kelly. The EK marked grave was situated by itself and on the opposite side of the yard where the rest of the graveyard was situated. The site foreman, Harry Franklin, retrieved the skull from EK marked grave and gave it to the police. As no provision has been made for the disposal of the remains, Mr. Franklin had the bodies reburied in Pentridge Prison at his own expense. The skull from the EK marked grave, which had been stored in the Victorian Penal Department, was taken to Canberra for research by the first director of the Australian Institute of Autonomy, Sir Colin Mackenzie, in 1934. A period of time it was lost, but was later found whilst cleaning out an old safe in 1952. In 1971, the institute gave it to the National Trust. In 1972, the school was put out on display at the old Melbourne Gaol until it was stolen on the 12th of December 1978. An investigation in 2010 proved that the display school was in fact the one recovered in April 1929. On the 9th of March 2008, it was announced that Australian archaeologists believed that they had found Mr. Kelly's grave on the site of Pentridge Prison. The bones were uncovered at a mass grave, and Mr. Kelly's are among those of 32 felons who have been executed by hanging. Jeremy Smith, a senior archaeologist at the Heritage Victoria, said that, "We believe we have conclusively found the burial site, but that is very different from finding the remains." Ellen Hollow, Mr. Kelly's then 62-year-old great-grandniece, offered to supply her own DNA to help identify Mr. Kelly's bones. On the anniversary of Mr. Kelly's hanging, on the 11th of November 2009, Tom Baxter handed the school in his possession to the police, and it was historically and forensically tested along with the Pentridge remains. The school was compared to the cast of the school that had been stolen from the old Melbourne Gaol in 1978, and it proved to be a match. The school was then compared to that in the newspaper photograph and the worker Alex Talbot holding the school recovered in 1929, which showed a close resemblance. Mr. Talbot was known to have taken the tooth from the school as a souvenir, and a media campaign to find his whereabouts of the tooth led to Mr. Talbot's grandson coming forward. The tooth was found to belong to the school, confirming it was indeed the school recovered in 1929. In 2004, before the school was handed in to the police, a cast of the school was made and compared to the death masks of those executed at the old Melbourne Gaol, which eliminated all but two. The two were Mr. Kelly and Ernest Knock, who had been executed in 1894 with the headstone marked EK 19394 and buried near Frederick Deeming, the headstone with the initials AW and a D underneath. In April 1929, the schools of EK marked grave, which was thought at the time to belong to Mr. Kelly, and Frederick Deeming were looted from the excavated caves. The death masks of Mr. Knox and the facial reconstruction cast of the school were a close match. In 2010 and 2011, the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine performed a series of craniofacial superimpositions, CT scanning, anthropology and DNA tests on the skull recovered from the EK marked grave and concluded it was not Mr. Kelly's. In 2014, the remains of Frederick Deeming's brother was exhumed from Beebington Cemetery and tissue samples were obtained from the femur bone. A DNA profile was successfully obtained from the samples and compared with a DNA profile that had been previously obtained from the skull that was stolen from the old Melbourne Gaol. The DNA profiles did not match, conclusively proving that the skull is not Mr. Deeming's. It is now accepted that the skull recovered in 1929 and later displayed in the old Melbourne Gaol was not Mr. Kelly's or Mr. Deeming's. Forensic pathologists also examined bones from Pentridge, which were much decayed and jumbled, with the remains of others making identification difficult. The collarbone was found to be the only bone which had survived in all the skeletons, and these were all DNA tested against that of Lee Olver. A match to Mr. Kelly was found, and the associated skeleton turned out to be one of the most complete. Mr. Kelly's remains were additionally identified by a partially healed right foot, right knee and left elbow injuries, matching those caused by bullet wounds at Glenrowan as recorded by the Gaol surgeon in 1880, and by the fact that his head was missing, likely removed the phrenological study. A section from the back of the skull, the optical, was recovered from the grave that bore saw cuts that matched those present on several neck vertebrae, indicating that the skull section belonged to the skeleton and that the illegal dissection had been performed. In August 2011, scientists publicly confirmed that a skeleton exhumed from the old Pentridge Prison's mass graveyard was indeed Mr. Kelly's, after comparing the DNA of that of Lee Olver. The DNA matching was based on the chondrical DNA, HV1 and HV2. This is indicative of Mr. Kelly's maternal line. The investigating forensic pathologists had indicated that no adequate quality somatic DNA was obtained that would be able to enable a Y DNA profile to be determined. This may be attempted at a later date. A Y DNA profile would enable Mr. Kelly's paternal genetic genealogy to be determined with reference to the data already existing in the Kelly Y DNA study. The skeleton was missing most of its skull, the whereabouts of which is unknown. On the 1st of August 2012, the Victorian government issued a licence for Mr. Kelly's bones to be returned to the Kelly family, who made plans for his final burial. The family also appealed for the person who possessed Mr. Kelly's skull to return it. On the 20th of January 2013, Mr. Kelly's relatives granted his final wish and buried his remains in the consecrated grounds at Greta Cemetery, near his mother's unmarked grave. A piece of Mr. Kelly's skull was also buried with his remains and was surrounded by concrete to prevent looting. A burial followed the Requiem Mass held on the 18th of January 2013 at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in Wangaratta. During the Great Depression, the Bayside City Council built bluestone walls to protect the local beaches from erosion. The stones were later taken to the outer walls of the Great Old Melbourne Gaol and included the headstones of those executed and buried on the grounds. Most, including Mr. Kelly's, were placed with the engravings, initials and date of execution facing inwards. The Ned Kelly myth has grown in Australian culture, and Mr. Kelly is one of Australia's most recognised national symbols. Academic and folklore Graham Seal writes, Ned Kelly has progressed from outlaw to national hero in a century, and to international icon in a further 20 years. The still enigmatic, slightly satire and ever ambivalent bushranger is the undisputed, if not universally admired, national symbol of Australia. Mr. Seal argues that Ned Kelly's story taps into a number of myths, including Robin Hood tradition of an outlaw hero and the myth of the Australian bush as a place of freedom of oppressive authority. Mr. Kelly is often seen as the embodiment of characteristics thought to be typically Australian, such as defying authority, siding with the underdog, and fighting bravely for one's beliefs. According to Ian Jones, after Mr. Kelly's death, a Robin Hood-like figure survived. Good-looking, brave, a fine horseman, a bushman, a crack shot, devoted to his mothers and sisters, a man who treated women with courtesy, who stole from the rich to give to the poor, who dressed himself in his enemy's uniform to outwit them. Most of all, a man who stood against the police, persecutors of his family, and was driven to be an outlaw when he defended his sister against a drunken constable. Such was Ned Kelly, the myth. Mr. Seal states that Mr. Kelly was aware of the bush ranger hero and attempted to live up to the myth. The Euroa and Geraldary raids were partly public performances where the Kelly gang acted courageously to women, burned down mortgage documents and entertained their hostages. By the time Mr. Kelly was outlawed, the bush ranger was an anachronism. Australia was highly urbanised. The telegraph and the railway were rapidly connecting the bush to the city, and Mr. Kelly was already an icon for the romanticised past. For Mr. Seal, the failure of the Kelly gang to derail the train at Glenrowan was a symbol of the triumph of the modern civilization. Mr. McIntyre states that Mr. Kelly turning agricultural equipment into defensive armour was an irresistible symbol of a passing era. Mr. Seal concludes, the figure of Ned Kelly has led to the creation of a national image that bears some relation to the man himself, perhaps about the same resemblance as Ned Kelly's armour had to the plough moldboards which it had been beaten from. He is different things to different people, a murderer, an Australian Robin Hood, a social bandit, a revolutionary leader, even a commercial commodity, but to most of us, he is somehow essentially Australian. Thanks to the Telegraph, the siege at Glenrowan became a national and international media event. Songs, poems, popular entertainment, fiction, books, and newspapers and magazine articles about the Kelly gang proliferated in the decades after Mr. Kelly's death. By 1943, there were 42 major published works about Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly has figured prominently in Australian cinema since 1906, since the 1906 release of The Story of the Kelly Gang, the world's first dramatic feature-length film. Among those who have portrayed him on screen are Australian rules football player Bob Chitty in The Glenrowan Affair in 1951, rock musician Mick Jagger in Ned Kelly in 1970, and Heath Ledger in Ned Kelly in 2003. A comic film, Reckless Kelly in 1993, drew on the Kelly legend. In the visual arts, Sidney Nolan's 1946 to 1947 Kelly series is considered one of the greatest sequences of Australian painting of the 20th century. His styled depiction of Mr. Kelly's helmet has become an almost iconic Australian image. Hundreds of performers dressed as nonetheless Kellys, starring in the opening ceremony of the 2000 Sydney Olympics. In literature, Douglas Stewart's verse drama Ned Kelly was first performed in 1942. Robert Drew's Our Sunshine in 1991 is a fictionalised account of the Glen Rowan siege. In 2001, Peter Carey won the Man Brooker Prize for his novel True History of the Kelly Gang, written from Mr. Kelly's perspective, which resulted in a 2019 film of the same name with the Anglo-Australian actor George Mackay portraying Mr. Kelly. The Ned Kelly Awards are Australia's premier prizes for crime fiction and true crime writing. The first ballads about the Kelly Gang were published in 1879, and it quickly became a popular genre. In 1939, Tex Merton recorded a country and western style ballad about Kelly, and singers included Slim Dusty, Smokey Dawson and Buddy Williams. Non-Australian artists who have recorded songs about Mr. Kelly include Waylon Jennings and Johnny Cash. The term Kelly tourism described towns such as Glen Rowan which sustained themselves economically almost entirely through the Ned's memory, while Kellyanna refers to collecting the Kelly memorabilia, merchandise and other paraphernalia. The phrase, "such is life, Mr. Kelly's perhaps final words," has become an oft-quoted part of legend. The game, as Ned Kelly, is an expression of bravery, and the term Ned Kelly beard is used to describe the trend in hipster fashion. The rural districts of northeastern Victoria are collectively known as Kelly Country. An 1879 political cartoon titled Our Readers, published in Melbourne Punch, depicts Mr. Kelly, Premier Graham Berry, and personification of the age, dancing around the flag of communism. In 1969, Eric Hobsbawm, in Bandits, argued that Ned Kelly was in tradition of the social bandit, a type of peasant outlaw and symbol of social rebellion with significant community support. Mr. McQuilton expanded on the social bandit thesis, arguing that the Kelly outbreak should be seen in the context of deteriorating economic conditions in rural Victoria in the 1870s, and a conflict over land between selectors, mostly small farmers, and squatters, mostly wealthy pastoralists, who had initially acquired their runs by squatting on the Crown land. Mr. Jones, Mr. Monolly and others argued that Ned Kelly was a political rebel with considerable support among other selectors, labourers in the northeastern Victoria. Mr. Jones claims that Mr. Kelly intended to derail the train at Glen Rowan to incite a rebellion, disinfect his selectors and declare a republic north of eastern Victoria. Others have disputed this claim. Mr. Morrissey argues that Mr. McQuilton and Mr. Jones have exaggerated the degree of economic distress and support for Mr. Kelly among local selectors. Mr. Dawson argues that Mr. Kelly did not draw up a Republican declaration or plan a political rebellion, writing, "There is no such moment in any document, plan or intention in any record of Mr. Kelly's day, nor in the numerous interviews or memoirs of those connected with the gang, or its prisoners who listened to Mr. Kelly's speeches whilst held up, nor in the work of the early historians of the outbreak who knew the Kellys, their gang, their sympathisers, or their pursuing of police." Mr. Seal states that Mr. Kelly proposed a basic form of wealth redistribution in his Gerald Deary letter, when the outlaw suggested that the wealthy squatters of the district should establish a charitable fund for the local poor, orphans and widows. Mr. Morrissey sees the social justice element of the letter as a traditional call for the rich to help the poor, with an additional argument that it is at their own interest to do so. While Mr. Kelly frequently complained of oppression by the police squatters, he invoked historical Irish grievances with the English. His response was expressed in terms of violent reckoning rather than a political program. Thank you for joining us today. What are your opinions on the crimes committed by Ned Kelly? Do you believe he was given a fair trial, or that the police had it in for him? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like and share, and if you're new to the channel and you want to see more Street Crime Australia content, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button so you can join us on the next video. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.